The summer of 1993 in Cedar Falls, Iowa, felt different from the start. The corn stood taller than usual in the endless fields stretching beyond the small town's limits, and the humidity hung thick as molasses over the weathered farmhouses and tree-lined streets. Sarah Chen had just graduated from Cedar Falls High School. Her acceptance letter to the University of Iowa was folded carefully in her bedroom drawer, a promise of escape from the town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Sarah's best friends since childhood, Amanda Rodriguez and Kelly Thompson, had their own plans for the summer before college. Amanda would stay local, working at her family's hardware store while taking classes at the community college. Kelly had secured a job at the local newspaper, hoping to build her portfolio before pursuing journalism at Northwestern University. The three girls had been inseparable since third grade. When Sarah's family moved to Cedar Falls from San Francisco, after her father's engineering job relocated him to John Deere's nearby facilities. If you're reading this story, please take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're from. We love connecting with people around the world. Now, let's continue with what happened that fateful summer day. The friendship among the three girls had weathered typical teenage storms: arguments over boys, competition for grades, and the natural growing pains of maturing in a small Iowa town. Sarah often felt like an outsider, being the only Asian American student in many of her classes. But Amanda and Kelly had embraced her differences, making her feel she belonged. Amanda's family had immigrated from Mexico when she was 5, so she understood the challenges of standing out in a predominantly white community. Kelly, despite being from one of Cedar Falls' oldest families, was drawn to outsiders and underdogs. The Rodriguez family lived in a modest two-bedroom house on the south side of town, where Maria worked as a seamstress at the local dry cleaner, and Carlos maintained the grounds at the Cedar Falls Cemetery. They had sacrificed everything to give Amanda opportunities they never had, and her acceptance to community college with plans to transfer to Iowa State represented the fulfillment of their American dream. Amanda carried this weight of expectation gracefully, but Sarah could see the pressure in her friend's eyes sometimes, the fear of disappointing parents who had given up so much. Kelly's situation was different but equally complex. The Thompsons had been in Cedar Falls for 4 generations, and Patricia Thompson's family had once owned much of the farmland, now subdivided into residential neighborhoods. But economic changes had gradually diminished the family's status, and Patricia worked 2 jobs, one at an insurance office during the day and another cleaning offices at night, to pay for Kelly's college applications and journalism camp the previous summer. Kelly's father had left when she was 12, and Patricia never spoke of him since, creating a void in Kelly's life that she tried to fill with academic achievement and an obsession with uncovering other people's secrets. Sarah's family represented stability in comparison. Her father, Dr. Michael Chen, worked as a mechanical engineer at the John Deere Technical Center, and her mother, Linda, taught piano lessons from their home on University Avenue. They had moved to Iowa reluctantly, missing the cultural diversity and opportunities of San Francisco, but had built a comfortable life in their new community. Sarah sometimes felt guilty about her advantages, especially when she saw Amanda counting every dollar earned at the hardware store or Kelly wearing the same 3 outfits to school in rotation. The plan for July 15th evolved over several conversations the previous week. Originally, they intended to spend the day at the Cedar Falls Recreation Center, swimming in the public pool and working on their tans before their summer jobs consumed their remaining free time. But Amanda suggested something more adventurous, a picnic at the Shell Rock River, where they could talk freely without worrying about running into classmates or family members who might overhear their conversations about boys, college fears, and dreams for the future. Sarah's mother was hesitant about the river trip, recalling stories from co-workers about teenage drinking parties and occasional drowning accidents. But after meeting Amanda and Kelly and extracting promises to stay in shallow areas and be home before dark, Linda packed them a lunch that could feed a small army: turkey sandwiches, fresh fruit from their garden, homemade chocolate chip cookies, and enough bottled water to last the entire day. All tucked into the wicker basket that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. The morning of July 15th dawned clear and hot, with a blue sky that made everything seem possible. Sarah woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent an hour choosing the perfect outfit, casual enough for a river picnic, but cute enough in case they encountered any interesting guys. She settled on denim shorts and a yellow tank top that Amanda had complimented during their last shopping trip to College Square Mall in Cedar Falls. Kelly arrived first, pulling into the Chen family's driveway in her beat-up Ford Escort just as Sarah loaded the picnic basket into the trunk. Kelly's car was a source of both pride and embarrassment. Pride because she had saved every penny from her part-time newspaper job to buy it from a co-worker's uncle, and embarrassment because it made concerning noises and had a temperamental air conditioning system that worked only when it felt like it, but it represented freedom, and that morning, it felt like the most beautiful car in the world. Amanda was waiting on her front porch when they pulled up to the Rodriguez house 20 minutes later. She had been ready for an hour, too anxious about keeping her friends waiting to do anything but sit and watch for Kelly's car. She carried a small backpack with sunscreen, extra hair ties, and the disposable camera she had bought specifically for their adventure. Amanda approached every experience as something to document and remember, perhaps because her family's frequent moves during her childhood had taught her that moments of happiness were precious and fleeting. The drive to the Shell Rock River took them through the heart of Iowa farmland, past fields of corn stretching to the horizon and farmhouses that looked like they belonged on postcards. Kelly rolled down all the windows, and they sang along to the radio at volumes that would have horrified their parents. Sarah felt a freedom she had never experienced before, the freedom of being 18, with the whole summer ahead, believing anything was possible if you wanted it badly enough. They passed through the small town of Shell Rock, population 147 according to the city limits sign, where a few elderly men sat outside the gas station, watching traffic and commenting on cars they recognized. The river access point they chose was about 5 miles beyond the town, recommended by Kelly's coworker at the newspaper, who assured them it was safe, family friendly, and never too crowded. What he didn't mention was how isolated it felt once you ventured away from the main swimming area. The parking area was a gravel lot that could hold maybe 15 cars, surrounded by oak and maple trees providing blessed shade from the already intense morning sun. A wooden sign posted by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources warned visitors about water safety, reminded them to pack out their trash, and noted that the area was patrolled by conservation officers, though Sarah noticed no official vehicles during their drive in. Other families had already claimed the best spots near the water, parents spreading blankets while children ran shrieking into the shallow pools, their screams of delight echoing across the water. A group of boys from Cedar Falls High School, whom Sarah recognized but didn't know well, had set up fishing gear downstream, their cooler undoubtedly containing more than just soft drinks and sandwiches. Everything felt normal, wholesome, and safe, the kind of summer day that would become a golden memory to revisit during stressful college exams or difficult adult decisions. The three friends found a spot upstream from the families but within shouting distance, spreading Sarah's grandmother's quilt on a patch of grass sloping gently to the water's edge. The river moved lazily here, no more than 3 feet deep and clear enough to see smooth stones and occasional fish darting between shadows. Amanda immediately began taking pictures of Kelly and Sarah arranging the food, the view of the water through the trees, a butterfly that landed on their quilt just long enough to be photographed. They spent the first hour wading in the water, splashing each other and trying to catch minnows in cupped hands. The cold water felt incredible against their sun, warmed skin, and Sarah relaxed in a way she hadn't since graduation. The pressures of college preparation, family expectations, and an uncertain future dissolved in the simple pleasure of being young and carefree with her best friends. As the morning progressed into afternoon, their conversation grew deeper and more intimate. They talked about their fears for college. Sarah worried about being homesick and struggling with engineering courses. Amanda feared her family had sacrificed too much for her education and that she wouldn't live up to their expectations. Kelly confessed her terror that she wasn't talented enough to make it in journalism and would end up stuck in Cedar Falls forever. They shared their dreams too. Sarah wanted to design cars that would help people. Amanda hoped to become a teacher and give back to immigrant communities. Kelly planned to become an investigative reporter, exposing corruption and helping the powerless. By 3:00 p.m., most families had packed up and headed home, and even the fishing boys had moved on to their evening plans. The three friends found themselves increasingly alone, which suited them perfectly. They were deep in a conversation about the boys they'd had crushes on throughout high school, rating them on various criteria and confessing embarrassing moments of unrequited affection, when Kelly noticed something she'd missed earlier. "Look," she said, pointing upstream where the river curved around a bend they hadn't explored. "I wonder what's around that corner. We've never been up there before." Sarah felt an inexplicable chill despite the afternoon heat, a premonition she couldn't name. Something about the way the trees grew thicker in that direction, creating shadows that seemed impenetrable even in broad daylight, made her want to stay exactly where they were. But Amanda was already standing, brushing grass from her shorts, and looking intrigued by the possibility of discovery. "Come on," Amanda said, her voice carrying the enthusiasm that always made her the group's leader. "We have time before we need to head back. Let's see what's up there." Kelly was already packing her camera into her backpack, and Sarah knew she was outvoted. She helped fold the quilt and gather their trash, but the feeling of unease grew stronger as they prepared to venture into unexplored territory. If she had trusted her instincts that day, if she had insisted they stay in the familiar safety of their spot, everything that followed might have been avoided. But 18-year-old girls don't always listen to premonitions, and the bonds of friendship sometimes override individual caution. Sarah followed her friends upstream toward whatever waited around the bend, carrying with her the last moments of innocence any of them would ever know. The walk upstream revealed a different character to the Shell Rock River than their picnic spot. Here, the water ran deeper and faster, carved into channels by decades of spring floods and summer storms. The trees grew closer to the water's edge, their branches creating a canopy so dense that the temperature dropped noticeably as they moved farther from the open areas where other visitors gathered. Wildflowers dotted the banks, black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers that Amanda stopped to photograph. But even the beauty of the natural setting couldn't shake Sarah's growing sense that they were moving towards something dangerous. Kelly led the way, her journalistic instincts drawn to unexplored places and untold stories, moving with the confidence of someone who had never encountered real danger, who believed curiosity was always rewarded and that bad things happened to other people in other places. Amanda followed close behind, her camera capturing images of interesting rock formations and the play of light through the leaves, while Sarah brought up the rear, fighting the urge to suggest they turn back. The sound of their voices and footsteps seemed muffled by the dense vegetation, as if the forest was swallowing their presence and erasing evidence of their passage. Occasionally, they startled a bird or small animal, the sudden movement and rustling leaves making all three girls jump and laugh nervously at their own reactions. But mostly, the woods felt empty and waiting, as if holding their breath for something about to happen. They had been walking for about 15 minutes when Amanda spotted a structure partially hidden by overgrown vegetation about 50 yards ahead. At first glance, it looked like a maintenance building or storage shed related to the state park, but as they approached, its abandoned and deteriorating condition became apparent. The roof sagged under the weight of fallen branches, one wall leaned precariously inward, and whatever paint had once covered the weathered wood had long since peeled away, leaving surfaces gray and splintered. "What do you think it is?" Kelly asked, already moving toward the building with her camera ready, her reporter's instincts fully engaged. Sarah could see the excitement in her friend's eyes as she anticipated the story they might discover. Amanda was more cautious, hanging back slightly. "It looks like it's been empty for years," she observed, noting the weeds growing waist, high around the foundation and small trees sprouting from gaps in the roof. Maybe it was a fishing cabin or something. Sarah said nothing, but her earlier premonition had crystallized into genuine fear. Everything about the building felt wrong. Its isolation, its state of decay, and most of all, the way it seemed forgotten by the world yet strangely intact. She wanted to suggest they take a few photos from a distance and head back, but Kelly was already approaching the structure's single door. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. Kelly pushed it open with her foot, and the rusty hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing through the woods like a warning. Inside, they could see the outline of what appeared to be furniture, a table, some chairs, and various objects scattered around the single room. "Hello," Kelly called into the interior, her voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't hide her nervousness. "Anyone in there?" When no response came, she stepped across the threshold, disappearing into the shadows. Amanda followed reluctantly, and Sarah found herself alone outside, every instinct screaming to run but unable to abandon her friends. The interior of the cabin was worse than Sarah had imagined. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and something else organic and unpleasant that made her stomach turn. Furniture included a wooden table stained with dark marks, several canvas chairs that looked like they belonged in a hunting lodge, and fishing equipment so old and rusted it seemed more like archaeological artifacts than functional tools. But it was the personal items scattered throughout the room that made all three girls freeze in horror. Clothing that had obviously belonged to women and girls lay in neat piles in the corners. Sundresses, jeans, blouses, and intimate garments, carefully sorted and arranged. Jewelry was displayed on the windowsill like trophies, mostly cheap costume pieces, but also a few more expensive items, including a high school class ring and what appeared to be an engagement ring with a small diamond. Most disturbing were the photographs covering every available wall surface, dozens of images showing women and girls of various ages, all taken without their knowledge from a distance. Some showed subjects at what looked like the same river where the girls had spent their day, while others appeared to have been taken in town or through windows. The photographs spanned several decades, based on clothing styles and the apparent ages of the cameras used. Amanda had gone completely pale, backing toward the door while clutching her camera protectively against her chest. Kelly, however, seemed transfixed by the display, her journalistic training overriding her fear as she began documenting everything with her own camera. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. Kelly continued taking pictures, the flash from her camera creating stark shadows that made the scene even more nightmarish. "This is evidence," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "Someone needs to document this before." She was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch outside, slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying to approach without being heard. All three girls froze, their eyes locked on the partially open door. Sarah felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain whoever was outside could hear it. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then twice, each board of the old porch creaking under the weight of the unseen visitor. Then the footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. For several eternal minutes, nothing happened except the sound of three teenage girls trying not to breathe. Storm clouds that had been building throughout the afternoon chose that moment to release their burden, and heavy rain began drumming against the metal roof with a sound like machine gun fire. The sudden noise was both a relief, it would mask any sounds they made, and a new source of terror, as it meant they would be trapped in the cabin until the storm passed. Then, gradually, the door began to creak open wider, pushed by an unseen hand. Sarah grabbed Amanda's arm and pulled her toward the boarded-up window at the back of the cabin, while Kelly remained frozen in the center of the room, still clutching her camera. The man who entered the cabin was older, probably in his 60s, with thinning gray hair plastered to his skull by the rain. His clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, work pants that were too short, a flannel shirt with multiple stains, and boots that looked like they had never been cleaned. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the three girls with a calculating expression that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent Sarah couldn't place. "Look what the storm brought me." Those words would echo in Sarah's mind for the next 31 years. The man moved with surprising agility for his apparent age, positioning himself between the girls and the door before any of them could react. His eyes lingered on each of them individually, as if making mental notes or comparisons to the photographs on the walls. "Now, girls," he said, his tone conversational, but with an underlying menace that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I'm going to need you to stay calm and listen carefully to what I tell you." Kelly found her voice first, perhaps drawing on her journalism training to maintain some semblance of composure, even in terrifying circumstances. "We were just exploring," she said, holding up her camera as if it explained everything. "We didn't mean to disturb anything. We can just leave and forget we were ever here." The man's smile revealed several missing teeth and others badly stained. "Oh, I don't think that's going to work," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You see, you've seen my collection now, my life's work, and I can't have you running back to town, telling stories about what you found up here." Amanda had begun crying quietly, tears streaming down her face as she pressed herself against the back wall of the cabin. Sarah put her arm around her friend, trying to offer comfort while her own mind raced through possible escape options. The boarded-up window behind them looked like it might give way with enough pressure, but that would mean leaving Kelly alone with this man. "Please," Sarah heard herself saying, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "We're just kids. We won't tell anyone about this place. We just want to go home." The man studied her with interest, as if her response had revealed something significant. "Kids," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose you are, though not for much longer." He moved closer to Kelly, who was still standing in the center of the room like a deer caught in headlights. "I've been watching you three," he continued, reaching out to touch Kelly's camera. "Down at the swimming spot earlier, such pretty girls having such a nice time. It reminded me of others who came here over the years, girls who thought they were safe, who thought nothing bad could happen to them in a nice place like Iowa." Kelly jerked her camera away from his touch, and the motion seemed to break whatever spell had held her motionless. "You're sick," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You're a sick old man who preys on young women, and when we get out of here, everyone is going to know what you are." The man's expression darkened, and Sarah saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "When you get out of here," he repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Oh, my dear girl, I'm afraid you have a fundamental misunderstanding about your situation." Sarah made her decision in that moment. While the man's attention was focused on Kelly, she yanked with all her strength on the plywood covering the back window. The wood gave way more easily than she expected, weakened by years of moisture and rot. As soon as the opening was large enough, she boosted Amanda through, whispering urgently for her to run and get help. Amanda disappeared into the rain-soaked woods just as the man spun around, his face contorted with rage. Sarah tried to follow her friend through the window, but he was on her before she could clear the opening. His hands grabbed her ankles and pulled her back into the cabin with such force that she crashed to the floor, pain shooting through her shoulder where she hit the rough wooden planks. "That was very foolish," the man said, standing over her with an expression of cold fury. "Now I'm going to have to hunt down your friend, and that's going to make me very unhappy. When I'm unhappy, bad things happen to the girls who cause my unhappiness." Kelly chose that moment to act, perhaps inspired by Sarah's attempt to help Amanda escape. She threw her camera at the man's head with all the force she could muster, the plastic casing cracking against his temple and causing him to stagger backward. In the same motion, she lunged for the door, but he recovered faster than seemed possible for someone his age. Sarah watched in horror as he caught Kelly by the hair, yanking her backward so violently that she screamed. The sound was cut short when he wrapped his arm around her throat, applying pressure until her struggles began to weaken. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, scrambling to her feet despite the pain in her shoulder. "Let her go. Take me instead." The man looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "Take you instead," he repeated. "Oh, my dear, you misunderstand again. I'm not choosing between you. I'm collecting both of you." But as he spoke, Sarah noticed his grip on Kelly had loosened slightly, and her friend's eyes met hers across the dim interior of the cabin. Kelly mouthed a single word, "Run." Then Kelly did something Sarah would replay in her mind thousands of times over the next 3 decades. Instead of trying to escape, she drove her elbow backward into the man's ribs with enough force to make him grunt in pain and release his hold on her throat. But instead of using that moment to flee, Kelly threw herself at him, wrapping her arms around his waist in what looked like an embrace, but was actually an attempt to hold him in place. "Go," Kelly screamed to Sarah. "Get out of here, find Amanda and get help." Sarah ran. She burst through the cabin door into the storm, immediately soaked to the skin by the torrential rain, and plunged into the woods without looking back. Behind her, she could hear Kelly screaming, but the sounds grew fainter as she crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at her clothes and face. For what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, Sarah ran through the storm, darkened woods, falling repeatedly on the slippery ground, getting up, and continuing forward through pure adrenaline and terror. She had no idea which direction she was heading, no sense of whether she was moving towards safety or deeper into danger. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, had to find help, had to save her friends. When she finally collapsed against a fallen tree, gasping and shivering, the storm was beginning to pass, and she could see patches of late afternoon sky through the canopy above. She was completely lost, with no idea how to get back to the river or find the road where they had left Kelly's car. But she was alive, and Amanda was somewhere out there in the woods, also alive, and maybe there was still time to save Kelly. Sarah spent that night huddled against the fallen tree, listening to every sound in the forest and jumping at the slightest noise. She dozed fitfully, waking repeatedly from nightmares in which she heard Kelly screaming her name, accusing her of abandoning her friends when they needed her most. When dawn broke, gray and misty through the trees, she began walking in what she hoped was the direction of the road. The sun was well up when Sarah stumbled onto Highway 218, about 5 miles south of where they had parked Kelly's car. She was still wearing her clothes from the day before, now torn and stained with mud and blood from countless scratches. A farmer named Earl Patterson found her walking along the shoulder of the road, clearly in distress, and stopped to help. "Jesus, honey, what happened to you?" Earl asked, getting out of his pickup truck and approaching Sarah with careful movements, not wanting to frighten an already traumatized person. Sarah tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled rush that probably didn't make much sense. Earl called the police from his truck radio, then wrapped Sarah in a blanket he kept behind the seat and stayed with her until the authorities arrived. Within an hour, the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department had mobilized every available officer for a search operation. Sarah led them back to the area where she thought the cabin was located, but when they arrived at the spot she identified, they found nothing but undisturbed forest, no cabin, no evidence that a structure had ever stood there, and no signs of a struggle or disturbance. The investigators were thorough and professional, but Sarah could see doubt creeping into their expressions as the search continued without results. They found Kelly's car exactly where she had parked it, the keys still in the ignition and her purse in the back seat. But despite bringing in tracking dogs from the Iowa State Patrol and organizing volunteer search teams that combed hundreds of acres of forest, no trace of Amanda Rodriguez or Kelly Thompson was ever found. The FBI became involved when agents learned the area where the girls disappeared was adjacent to federal land administered by the Army Corps of Engineers. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez flew in from the Chicago field office to take charge of the investigation, bringing resources and expertise the local authorities lacked. Agent Martinez had worked dozens of missing persons cases, but something about the Cedar Falls disappearances felt different from the beginning. "I've seen a lot of cases where people disappear," Agent Martinez told Sarah during one of their many interviews. "Usually there's some kind of trail, physical evidence, witnesses, financial records, something that gives us a place to start, but your friends seem to have vanished without leaving any trace at all." Sarah's account never wavered during the hundreds of hours of questioning that followed. She described the man in the cabin in exhaustive detail, sketched the interior layout of the structure, and provided information about the photographs and personal items they had found. But without physical evidence to corroborate her story, some investigators began to wonder if trauma had affected her memory of events. The search for Amanda and Kelly consumed the summer of 1993 and continued sporadically through the fall. Investigators interviewed everyone the girls had known, examined their personal belongings for clues, and followed up on hundreds of tips from people who thought they had seen them. The case generated national media attention for a brief period, with the girls' photographs appearing on missing persons' websites and milk cartons throughout the Midwest. As the first anniversary of the disappearances approached, the Chen family made the difficult decision to move back to California. Sarah's parents felt that staying in Cedar Falls would prevent their daughter from healing and moving forward with her life, and Sarah herself was eager to escape the constant reminders of that terrible day. Before leaving Iowa, Sarah visited the families of her missing friends one final time. The Rodriguez family had aged years in the span of months. Maria had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and Carlos had developed a persistent tremor that made his hands shake whenever he wasn't actively using them. They had converted Amanda's bedroom into a shrine of sorts, leaving everything exactly as it had been on July 15th, while adding missing person flyers, search maps, and correspondence with investigators. "We know she's still alive," Maria told Sarah, clutching a rosary that had belonged to her own mother. "A mother knows these things. Somewhere out there, our Amanda is waiting for us to find her." Patricia Thompson had reacted to Kelly's disappearance differently. Instead of creating shrines or maintaining hope, she had thrown herself into the investigation with single-minded determination. Her kitchen table was covered with maps, photographs, and notebooks filled with her own theories about what had happened. "Your story doesn't add up," Patricia told Sarah bluntly during their final meeting. "I'm not saying you're lying, but there are holes in it big enough to drive a truck through. How does an entire cabin just disappear? How do two 18-year-old girls vanish without leaving any evidence behind? Someone knows something, and until I find out what that is, I'm not giving up." Sarah left Cedar Falls carrying the weight of Patricia Thompson's suspicions along with her own survivor's guilt. The move to California helped in some ways. New schools, new friends, and the anonymity of a large city allowed her to reinvent herself as someone other than that girl whose friends disappeared. But the nightmares followed her across the continent, and she found herself unable to enjoy simple pleasures like hiking or camping that had once brought her joy. College at UC Berkeley was both an escape and a prison. Sarah threw herself into her engineering studies with an intensity that worried her parents and impressed her professors. She rarely socialized, dated infrequently, and spent most of her free time in the library or computer lab. Her academic success came at the cost of the carefree college experience she had once imagined sharing with Amanda and Kelly. But achievement felt safer than friendship, and solitude felt safer than trust. Sarah graduated summa cum laude in 1997 and immediately began working for a software company in Silicon Valley specializing in automotive design systems. Her colleagues found her brilliant but distant, someone who could solve complex technical problems but rarely joined them for lunch or after-work social events. She lived alone in a small apartment in Mountain View, kept minimal personal belongings, and maintained contact with her parents but few others. The years passed with a sameness Sarah found comforting: work, home, sleep, repeat. Occasional phone calls from Detective Morrison in Cedar Falls, who had never officially closed the case and continued following up on sporadic leads and tips. Brief, awkward conversations with Amanda's parents on the anniversary of the disappearances, during which they updated each other on the lack of new developments and promised to stay in touch. In 2003, Sarah met David Kim at a technology conference in San Jose. He was a patent attorney specializing in intellectual property issues related to software development, and their initial professional relationship gradually evolved into something personal. David was patient with Sarah's reluctance to share details about her past and didn't pressure her when she declined invitations to go camping or visit remote locations for weekend getaways. They married in 2005 in a small ceremony attended only by immediate family, and Sarah hyphenated her name to Chen Kim. 2 daughters followed, Jennifer in 2007 and Lisa in 2009. For the first time since 1993, Sarah began to believe happiness might be possible again. But even as she embraced her new roles as wife and mother, the ghosts of her past continued to haunt her daily decisions. Sarah installed security systems in their home that would have been appropriate for a government facility. She enrolled her daughters in self-defense classes before they were old enough to understand why. Family vacations were always to crowded destinations with extensive security infrastructure, theme parks, major cities, popular beach resorts. Never to isolated locations where something might happen beyond the reach of immediate help. David understood that his wife's protectiveness stemmed from trauma, but worried about the effect it might have on their daughters. Jennifer and Lisa grew up believing the world was full of predators waiting to hurt young women, that trusting strangers was foolish, and that safety required constant vigilance. It wasn't the childhood David had envisioned for them, but it was the price of loving someone who had survived what Sarah had survived. The 20th anniversary of the disappearances in 2013 brought renewed media attention to the case. A documentary filmmaker contacted Sarah about participating in a film about unsolved mysteries, and several true crime podcasts wanted to interview her about her experience. Sarah declined all requests, but she couldn't prevent others from speculating about what had happened or developing theories ranging from plausible to absurd. Detective Morrison, now a lieutenant approaching retirement, used the anniversary publicity to make one final appeal for information. New forensic techniques and advances in DNA analysis had given investigators tools unavailable in 1993. And Morrison hoped someone with knowledge about the case might finally come forward. But despite hundreds of new tips and leads, the investigation yielded no breakthroughs. Amanda's parents had grown old waiting for news that never came, Carlos had developed heart problems that limited his ability to work, and Maria had suffered a series of small strokes affecting her memory and speech. They still lived in the same house on Elm Street, still maintained Amanda's bedroom as a shrine, but their hope had evolved into resignation. Patricia Thompson had never remarried or moved away from Cedar Falls. She had become a local fixture, known for her obsessive investigation into her daughter's disappearance and her willingness to chase down any lead, no matter how unlikely. She had spent her savings on private investigators and accumulated boxes of documents related to the case, but her efforts produced no more results than the official investigation. Sarah's life in California continued its orderly progression through the 2010s. Her daughters grew into teenagers who chafed at their mother's overprotective rules but understood arguing was useless. Jennifer developed an interest in criminal justice, claiming it was unrelated to her mother's past, but it made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. Lisa preferred mathematics and computer science, fields Sarah felt were safer because they dealt with abstract problems rather than human dangers. David's law practice flourished, allowing the family to live comfortably in an upscale neighborhood where crime was rare and security excellent. Sarah continued working in software design, focusing on systems to improve automotive safety, a career choice that felt like a way to protect strangers from the random dangers that had destroyed her youth. As the 30th anniversary of the disappearances approached in 2023, Sarah found herself thinking more frequently about Amanda and Kelly. She had dreams where they were all 18 again, sitting by the river, planning their futures, unaware of what waited upstream. Sometimes in these dreams, Sarah tried to warn them not to explore further, but her voice wouldn't work, and she could only watch as they walked toward disaster. The dreams intensified as July 15, 2023, approached, becoming so vivid that Sarah began waking up exhausted, as if she had spent her sleeping hours reliving that terrible day. David suggested therapy to process her survivor's guilt, but Sarah couldn't imagine explaining to a stranger the complex emotions she carried. Guilt over escaping when her friends hadn't, anger at herself for not fighting harder to save them, and secret relief that she had survived when they hadn't. On the actual anniversary, Sarah took the day off work and spent it looking through old photographs of her time in Cedar Falls. She had only a few pictures from their senior year, group photos from school events, candid shots from teenage adventures, and one formal portrait of the three friends taken at the local Sears studio for their graduation announcements. Looking at those images of three young women who believed the world was full of possibilities, Sarah felt the familiar ache of loss that had never fully healed. That evening, she called Amanda's parents for their annual check-in. Maria's health had declined significantly over the past year, and she struggled to remember details about the investigation or even recognize Sarah's voice. Carlos was more alert, but his words were heavy with the exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 decades hoping for news that would never come. "We're not going to live to see her again," Carlos told Sarah with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had accepted an unbearable truth. "But maybe your daughters will. Maybe someday someone will find out what happened to our girls." Sarah promised to stay in touch and never forget Amanda and Kelly, but after ending the call, she wondered if it might be kinder to let the past remain buried. The investigation had consumed enormous resources and destroyed lives without producing answers, and continuing to hope for resolution seemed like self-torture. But as she prepared for bed that night, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. For the first time since 1993, she got down on her knees and prayed, not to any specific deity, but to whatever force in the universe might be listening, that Amanda and Kelly, wherever they were, knew they had been loved, remembered, and mourned for 30 years. She prayed that their suffering, if they had suffered, was over, that their families would find peace, and that she would be forgiven for surviving when they hadn't, for building a life on the foundation of their absence, for being the one who got to grow up and grow old while they remained forever 18 in everyone's memories. Sarah had no way of knowing that hundreds of miles away, in a location she could never have imagined, Amanda Rodriguez was also praying that night. But Amanda's prayers were different, for the strength to keep silent, for the wisdom to know when silence was the greatest gift she could give to the people she loved, and for the courage to make choices that would protect others, even if those choices meant sacrificing her own chance for justice. The next morning brought the kind of humid Iowa summer day Sarah remembered from her childhood, though she experienced it through the air-conditioned comfort of her Silicon Valley home. She went to work, attended meetings, reviewed code, and lived the life she had built in the shadow of tragedy. But something had shifted the night before. Some internal door had opened or closed, and she found herself thinking about Amanda and Kelly, not with the sharp grief that usually accompanied their memory, but with a peaceful acceptance. That acceptance would be shattered exactly 1 year later, but for now, it was enough to allow Sarah to sleep peacefully for the first time in months. The call came on July 14, 2024 at 11:47 p.m. Pacific Time. Sarah was reading in bed while David slept beside her, enjoying the rare quiet after both daughters had finally turned off their lights and stopped texting their friends. The phones ringing in the silent house made her jump, and her first thought was that something had happened to her parents, now in their 70s and dealing with various health issues. But the voice on the other end was weak and hoarse, carrying an accent Sarah hadn't heard in 31 years but recognized immediately. "Sarah, it's me. It's Amanda." Sarah dropped the phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely pick it up again. David woke up, alarmed by her sudden movement and the expression on her face. "Sarah," the voice continued when she managed to get the phone back to her ear. "Are you there, Amanda?" Sarah whispered, not trusting herself to speak louder. "Is it really you? Where are you? Are you okay?" There was a long pause filled with static and what sounded like traffic in the background. When Amanda spoke again, her words were carefully measured, as if rehearsed many times. "I'm at a gas station outside Cedar Falls. I need help getting home, but I can't talk about where I've been, not now, maybe not ever." Sarah was already getting out of bed, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. David was sitting up now, wide awake, trying to understand what was happening from Sarah's side of the conversation. "I'll come get you," Sarah said, surprising herself with the decisiveness of her response. "I can be there by tomorrow evening. Just tell me exactly where you are." Amanda gave her the address of a truck stop on Interstate 380, about 10 miles south of Cedar Falls. She promised to wait there until Sarah arrived, but her voice carried an undertone of urgency suggesting she might not be able to wait long. "Sarah," Amanda said before ending the call, "I need you to know that Kelly," her voice broke, and she was silent for several seconds. "Kelly isn't coming home, but she saved us both in the end. She saved us both." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in the darkness of her bedroom, trying to process what had just happened. David was asking questions, but his voice seemed to come from far away. After 31 years of wondering, waiting, and grieving, Amanda Rodriguez was alive and asking for help. Sarah was on a plane to Iowa 6 hours later. The flight from San Francisco to Cedar Rapids gave her time to think about what she might find when she reached the truck stop where Amanda was waiting. 31 years was a lifetime, long enough for a missing teenager to become a middle-aged woman, for wounds to heal or fester into permanent damage, for hope to die, be reborn, and die again. Sarah had changed dramatically during those 3 decades, evolving from a traumatized 18-year-old into a successful professional wife and mother. But what had those years done to Amanda? Where had she been? Why had she been unable to contact her family or the authorities? And what had happened to Kelly that made Amanda so certain she would never be coming home? The truck stop where Amanda waited sat at the intersection of 2 highways, surrounded by cornfields stretching to the horizon. It was the kind of anonymous place where travelers stopped for gas and food without thinking about the stories of the people they encountered, where someone could wait for hours without attracting attention or suspicion. Sarah spotted Amanda immediately, despite the decades that had passed. She was sitting alone at a corner table in the restaurant section, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the parking lot through the large windows facing the interstate. 31 years had transformed the 18-year-old girl into a woman in her late 40s, but something essential and recognizable remained. Amanda was thin, too thin, and her clothes looked like they came from a thrift store or charity organization. Her dark hair was now streaked with gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands showed the wear of years of manual labor. But her eyes were the same warm brown Sarah remembered, though now they held a weariness speaking of experiences no teenager should have endured. When Amanda saw Sarah walking toward her table, her face crumpled with an emotion that might have been relief, grief, or simple exhaustion. They embraced for a long time without speaking, two middle-aged women holding on to each other in a truck stop restaurant while truckers and travelers moved around them, oblivious to the magnitude of the moment. "I can't believe you came," Amanda said when they finally separated. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure you'd even be in California still, or if you'd kept the same name after you got married." Sarah wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but something in Amanda's demeanor suggested pushing for immediate answers would be a mistake. Instead, she focused on practical matters, getting Amanda something to eat, finding her a place to stay, and making contact with her family. "Your parents," Sarah began, but Amanda interrupted with a sharp shake of her head. "Not yet," she said firmly. "I need time to figure out how to do this, how to explain where I've been without explaining where I've been, if that makes sense." It didn't make sense, but Sarah had learned over the years that some things couldn't be rushed or forced. If Amanda needed time, Sarah would give her as much as she required. They drove to Cedar Falls in Sarah's rental car, traveling roads that were familiar despite the decades that had passed. The town had grown and changed, new developments where there had once been farmland, updated storefronts in the downtown area, a Walmart, and other chain stores that hadn't existed when they were teenagers. But the essential character of the place remained, and Sarah found herself remembering why she had been so eager to leave and why others had chosen to stay. The hotel where Sarah booked rooms was new, part of a chain catering to business travelers and families visiting the University of Northern Iowa. Amanda seemed overwhelmed by the lobby's bright lights and the casual efficiency of the check-in process, as if she had forgotten how to navigate ordinary social interactions. In Sarah's room, they sat facing each other across a small table, the weight of 31 years of separation and mystery hanging between them like a physical presence. Amanda accepted a bottle of water, but declined offers of food, claiming she wasn't hungry despite her obvious malnourishment. "I know you have questions," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know everyone will have questions, but some answers come with prices too high to pay." Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that truth and justice were worth any risk, but looking at her friend's face, seeing the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the careful way she positioned herself near the door, as if always ready to flee, Sarah began to understand that Amanda had already paid prices no one should have to pay. "Can you tell me about Kelly?" Sarah asked gently. Amanda's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Kelly tried to save us both. When that man took us from the cabin, she fought him every step of the way. She never stopped trying to help us escape, even when—" Amanda's voice broke, and she was silent for several seconds. "Even when it became clear that fighting only made things worse." The story that emerged over the next several hours was fragmentary and incomplete, told in fits and starts as Amanda struggled to find words for experiences that had no adequate language. She and Kelly had been moved frequently over the years, never staying in one location long enough to form attachments or learn enough about their surroundings to be useful to potential rescuers. Their captor Amanda never referred to him by name if she had ever learned it, was part of a network of people who trafficked young women for reasons ranging from labor to entertainment to simple obsession with control. 3 decades of Amanda's captivity had been spent in various locations throughout the Midwest and South, working in agricultural operations, cleaning services, and other businesses operating on the margins of legality. Kelly had died 5 years into their captivity, Amanda revealed, though she refused to provide details about the circumstances. She never stopped planning escapes, Amanda said. She never stopped believing we could get home somehow, and in the end, her planning worked, just not the way she thought it would. Amanda explained that Kelly had managed to establish contact with other victims in their network, creating a communication system that eventually enabled some to coordinate resistance efforts. It took years to build trust and develop plans that wouldn't endanger other captives, but Kelly's journalistic instincts had served her well in documenting their captors' patterns and vulnerabilities. "Kelly saved me," Amanda said simply. "She traded her life for mine, and for the possibility that others might eventually be freed too. The network started falling apart after she died, but it took another 26 years for the situation to deteriorate enough that some of us could finally escape." Amanda was vague about the details of her actual escape, saying only that their captors' organization had been weakened by internal conflicts and law enforcement pressure unrelated to the Cedar Falls disappearances. When an opportunity arose to leave, she had taken it, but only after promising not to provide information that could be used to track down other victims still trapped. "There are others," Amanda said, her voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. "Women and girls who are still being held, and if I cooperate with any investigation, if I provide details that could lead law enforcement to the locations where I was held, those people will be moved or eliminated. The only reason I was allowed to leave was because I promised to convince everyone to stop looking." Sarah struggled to understand the moral calculations that had led to such an arrangement. How could letting criminals go free be justified by protecting victims who might never be found anyway? But as she watched Amanda speak, saw how her friend's entire body tensed when discussing the possibility of law enforcement involvement, Sarah began to grasp the terrible mathematics of survival that had governed Amanda's life for 3 decades. The reunion with Amanda's parents the next day was both joyful and heartbreaking. Maria Rodriguez was now in the advanced stages of dementia, and while she recognized her daughter, seemed confused about how much time had passed and where Amanda had been. Carlos wept openly as he held his daughter for the first time since she was 18, but Sarah could see the questions burning in his eyes, questions he was afraid to ask because he feared the answers. The small house on Elm Street had been preserved almost exactly as it was in 1993, as if Amanda's parents had been waiting for her return and didn't want her to feel disoriented by changes. Amanda's bedroom still contained her high school textbooks, her collection of stuffed animals, and the graduation dress she had never gotten to wear. The sight of these artifacts from her interrupted youth seemed to overwhelm Amanda, and she spent most of the first day sitting quietly in the backyard, staring at the sky as if she had forgotten what it looked like. News of Amanda's return spread quickly through Cedar Falls, despite the family's attempts to maintain privacy. Local reporters gathered outside the Rodriguez house, hoping for interviews or photographs, while neighbors and former classmates called constantly, wanting to welcome Amanda home and satisfy their curiosity about where she had been. The attention clearly distressed Amanda, who seemed to shrink into herself whenever strangers approached. Detective Morrison, now retired but still passionate about the case that had defined his career, arrived at the Rodriguez house within hours of learning about Amanda's return. He was gentler than Sarah expected, perhaps recognizing that Amanda's mental state was fragile and that pushing too hard for information might drive her away again. "I just want you to know that we never stopped looking," Morrison told Amanda as they sat in her parents' living room. "Every lead, Every tip, every possibility, we followed them all. I'm sorry we couldn't find you sooner." Amanda thanked him but declined to answer questions about her captivity or provide information that might help locate other victims. When Morrison pressed her about the moral obligation to help others who might still be suffering, Amanda's response was firm and final. "I've already saved everyone I can save," she said. "And I've already sacrificed everything I can sacrifice. If you try to investigate this further, you'll destroy the lives of people who have survived things you can't imagine, and you won't rescue anyone." The FBI agents who arrived from Chicago were less understanding of Amanda's position. Special Agent Martinez, now close to retirement herself, had never forgotten the Cedar Falls case and saw Amanda's return as an opportunity to solve not just this disappearance, but potentially dozens of others. The agents spent hours trying to convince Amanda that witness protection programs and other law enforcement tools could keep her safe while she provided testimony. But Amanda refused all offers of protection and assistance, repeating her claim that any cooperation with authorities would endanger other victims. When the agents threatened to subpoena her testimony or hold her as a material witness, Amanda simply smiled sadly and said, "You can't force someone to remember what they've chosen to forget." It became clear over the following days that Amanda had made a decision to protect other victims by sacrificing any chance of justice for herself. She would not identify her captors, describe the locations where she had been held, or provide details about the network that had controlled her life for 31 years. Her silence was absolute and non-negotiable. Patricia Thompson learned about Amanda's return from a neighbor who had seen the news reports. She arrived at the Rodriguez house 2 days later, carrying a box of documents and photographs related to her daughter's disappearance. The meeting between Patricia and Amanda was tense and emotional, with Patricia desperate for any information about Kelly's fate and Amanda able to provide only limited details. "She talked about you constantly," Amanda told Patricia. "Even years into our captivity, Kelly would tell stories about growing up in Cedar Falls, about her plans to become a journalist, about how proud you were of her writing. She never forgot how much you loved her." Patricia broke down completely when Amanda described Kelly's death, though Amanda provided no details beyond the fact that it had occurred 5 years after their disappearance. The knowledge that her daughter had lived for 5 years in captivity, that she had suffered for so long while Patricia continued her desperate search, seemed almost harder to bear than the original disappearance had been. "She saved you," Patricia said through her tears. "My Kelly saved you, that's something. At least that's something she would have been proud of." Amanda nodded, crying herself for the first time since her return. "She was the bravest person I've ever known, and she never stopped believing that somehow, someway, we would find a way home." After a week in Cedar Falls, Amanda announced she was leaving again. She had reunited with her family, honored Kelly's memory, and done everything she could to provide closure without endangering other victims. Now, she said, she needed to start over somewhere new, under a different identity, away from the media attention and constant questions about her missing years. "I can't be Amanda Rodriguez anymore," she explained to Sarah during their final conversation. "That girl died in the woods 31 years ago. The person I am now needs a different name, a different life, a different story." Sarah wanted to argue, to convince her friend to stay and rebuild the life that had been stolen from her. But she recognized that Amanda had earned the right to make her own choices about her future. If starting over somewhere else was what Amanda needed to heal, Sarah would support that decision. Before leaving Cedar Falls, Amanda gave Sarah a letter to deliver to Kelly's mother. Patricia read it privately, but afterward told Sarah it contained details about Kelly's final years that had given her both comfort and closure. The letter also included specific information about Kelly's dreams and hopes that only someone who had known her intimately could have provided, proving beyond doubt that Amanda's account of their shared captivity was true. Amanda's second disappearance was voluntary and complete. She left no forwarding address, no way to contact her, and no trace of where she might be going. The media lost interest once it became clear no dramatic revelations or criminal prosecutions would result from her return, and Cedar Falls gradually returned to its normal routines. The official case files for Amanda Rodriguez and Kelly Thompson remain open, though no active investigation continues. The FBI occasionally receives tips or reports of similar disappearances, but without Amanda's cooperation, there are no viable leads to pursue. The network that held her captive has either dissolved or adapted to avoid detection, and the other victims Amanda spoke of have never been found. Sarah returned to California with a sense of completion that had eluded her for 3 decades. Seeing Amanda alive, even damaged and secretive, had lifted the survivor's guilt that had shaped her entire adult life. She finally understood that her escape from the cabin that day hadn't been abandonment of her friends, but the first step in a chain of events that had ultimately enabled Amanda's survival. But Sarah also carried new burdens, the knowledge that somewhere in America, other young women were living the nightmare Amanda had survived, and that the decision to remain silent about their existence was a form of complicity with their captors. The moral complexity of Amanda's choices haunted Sarah's dreams, replacing the old nightmares about that day at the river with new ones about victims she would never meet and could never help. Over the months that followed, Sarah received occasional updates about Amanda through her parents. Their daughter was alive and safe somewhere under a new identity, had found work that allowed her to support herself, and had even formed new relationships with people who knew nothing about her past. Amanda had asked her parents not to try to contact her directly, explaining that complete separation from her old life was necessary for her psychological healing. Carlos Rodriguez passed away in his sleep 18 months after Amanda's return, his heart finally giving out under the weight of emotions he had carried for over 3 decades. Maria's dementia progressed rapidly after her husband's death, and she was moved to a memory care facility where she spent her remaining days believing Amanda was still 18 and would be home from school soon. Patricia Thompson used the insurance money from Kelly's presumed death to establish a foundation providing support services for families of missing persons. She never remarried and never left Cedar Falls, choosing instead to become an advocate for other parents facing the nightmare she had endured. She died of cancer in 2029, leaving behind a legacy of help for families whose children had vanished without explanation. Detective Morrison wrote a book about unsolved cases from his career, dedicating a chapter to the Cedar Falls disappearances. He respected Amanda's privacy by not revealing details about her return, but used the case to illustrate the complex moral questions that arise when solving crimes might endanger innocent people. He never learned Amanda's new identity or location, though he sometimes wondered if she was among the readers who sent him letters praising his decision to respect victims' rights over investigative curiosity. Sarah's daughters grew up knowing only that their mother had lost close friends in a tragedy when she was young. As they entered their own teenage years, Sarah found herself able to relax slightly about their safety, though she never stopped being more protective than other parents. Jennifer pursued her interest in criminal justice and became a victims' rights advocate, while Lisa followed her mother into software engineering, focusing on systems that could help law enforcement solve cold cases more efficiently. The abandoned cabin where everything had begun was never found again, despite multiple search teams combing the area around the Shell Rock River over the years using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced detection equipment. Some investigators theorized the building had been demolished and its remains scattered, while others suggested trauma had affected the girl's memories of its exact location. Sarah never returned to the Shell Rock River, though she drove past the access road several times during visits to Iowa for her parents' funerals. The area looked exactly as it had in 1993. Families swimming in the shallow pools, teenagers gathering on the banks, children playing in the water under their parents' watchful eyes. The normalcy of the scene felt both comforting and heartbreaking, a reminder that life continued even after the worst imaginable things had happened. In 2030, 37 years after that terrible day, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of two women standing on a beach, their faces turned toward the ocean. One was clearly Amanda, now in her mid-50s, looking healthier and more at peace than she had during her brief return to Cedar Falls. The other woman was unfamiliar to Sarah, but something about the way she stood next to Amanda suggested a close relationship, perhaps even love. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting Sarah recognized, was written, "Some of us found our way to happiness. Thank you for helping make that possible. A.R." Sarah kept the photograph on her desk at work, where it served as a daily reminder that survival takes many forms and that sometimes the greatest gift friends can give each other is the freedom to choose their own definitions of closure and healing. She never tried to trace the photograph's origin or find Amanda's current location, understanding that respect for her friend's privacy was the final act of loyalty she could offer. The story of three friends who vanished at a river in 1993 officially ended when one returned and chose to remain silent. But the real story of love and sacrifice, impossible choices, and moral complexity